Welcome to the TOEFL podcast number 8. This is the TOEFL podcast episode 8, your place to practice for the TOEFL, the Test of English as a Foreign Language, or the IELTS, or just to get a little more English. My name is Dr. Jeff McQuillan from the Center for Educational Development in Los Angeles, California. Today's TOEFL podcast is about asking questions about a lecture. Let's listen to the dialogue first at a slow speed, then explanations, then we'll listen again at a fast speed, and we'll finish with some comprehension questions. Here we go.
This theory is supported by a series of studies conducted beginning in the 1960s. You'll be reading about that in your assigned chapter for next week, and we'll be deconstructing it in class next Monday. Any questions? Yes, you have a question?
Could you please explain how this theory is related to the discussion we had last week?
Well, the ideas we discussed last week are the foundation upon which this theory is based. One is a precursor to the other. Any other questions? Yes, you have another question?
Yes, I'm not sure what you mean by deconstruct.
When we talk about deconstructing an idea, theory, image, or whatever else in this class, I'm using it to mean that we will examine the underlying assumptions and the driving principles. Is that clear?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last part. Could you repeat what you said?
I said that I use deconstruction to mean looking at the underlying assumptions and the principles behind the idea.
Thank you. Will this be on the midterm?
As I've said before, any of the lecture or reading material can be on the midterm. If there are no other questions, I'll see you on Friday.
We listened to an exchange between a professor and a student, that is, a conversation at the end of class. The professor is explaining about a series of studies conducted beginning in the 1960s. A study is a common term. It means a research or an investigation effort, something that a professor or a scientist does to find out information. They conduct, and that's the verb we use. To conduct means to carry out or to do a study. These studies began in the 1960s. Notice that we use the definite article, the 1960s, the 1980s, to refer to the years in that particular time period. The professor tells the students that they will be reading things in their assigned chapter. A chapter of a book, of course, is a part of a book. Books are divided into chapters, and assigned is what they are supposed to read. So your assigned chapter is what the professor tells you you have to read. The professor uses a term deconstruct or deconstructing. I don't want to talk too much about deconstruction, but here the professor uses it and defines that term. The student asks some questions about the lecture, and he uses a very polite form to ask questions. Could you please explain how? Again, the could you please is a very nice or polite way of asking a question. The professor answers this particular question by saying that the ideas they discussed last week are the foundation upon which this theory is based. The foundation is a word that comes from a building or a house. The foundation is what you build the house on. Nowadays, you'll have a big piece of concrete that is solid, and you build a house on top of it. The foundation in this lecture, the professor is referring to the basis, what supports all the other things. We often talk about the foundation of something as a metaphor to mean what something is built upon, what ideas are built upon, or physical things are built upon. A theory is based on something. To be based on something, B-A-S-E-D, means that is what the theory is connected to. That is what the theory, where the theory comes from, where it gets its support. The professor used the term, one is a precursor to the other. The term precursor just means a thing that comes before something else. So that if you hear lightning and thunder in the sky, that's often a precursor to rain, something that comes before it. And we use the expression precursor to something else. The student has another question, and he says, I'm not sure what you mean by deconstruct. This is another way of asking, could you define that term? I don't understand what you are saying. We use this expression a lot, I don't understand what you mean, to say, I don't understand, or I'm not sure what you mean. The professor says that the term deconstruct here means that they will be looking at the underlying assumptions and driving principles. Several common academic words there. First is assumptions. The assumption, or an assumption, is something that you take for granted. That is to say, you believe that it is true, and you don't question it, and you use that belief to go on and make other conclusions. So those are assumptions are things that you believe are true and that you're not going to try to prove or investigate. Something that is underlying, underlying, something that is underlying means that it is below or beneath. So when someone says the underlying assumptions, they mean the assumptions or the ideas that form the foundation, we could say, or the basis for your theory or ideas. Similarly, the expression driving principles refers to ideas or main ideas. A principle, P-R-I-N-C-I-P-L-E, means a idea or a concept. When you use the adjective driving, the driving force or the driving principle, you mean the idea that is influencing, strongly influencing other ideas and other concepts. Now the student, who doesn't appear to be a very good student, says, I'm sorry, but I didn't hear that last part. That is, the last part or section of what you said. Could you repeat what you said? Again, it's a polite way. He apologizes, I'm sorry, and then asks, could you repeat or say again what you said? And the professor repeats the basic definition and talks about the principles behind the idea. In other words, the ideas or concepts When we say something is behind the idea, we mean what goes into the idea, what supports the idea. The student asks then the classic, typical question that students ask professors: will this be on the midterm? A midterm, M-I-D-T-E-R-M, is an examination, a test that you get not at the end, not at the beginning of the semester, but in the middle. That's why we call it the midterm. And most university classes in the United States have midterm exams. So if you have a 10-week quarter, the midterm exams would be the 5th or 6th week. And then you have what are called final exams. Those come at the end of the term. Sometimes they're just called finals. So when American students say, I have finals next week, they mean they have their final or last examinations for that particular course. The professor reminds the student that any of the lecture or reading material can be on the midterm. Lecture, of course, is when the professor gives a talk, and the reading material, you probably know, are the articles and books that the students are supposed to read. Material here just means information. Now let's listen to the dialogue, this time at a native rate of speech.
This theory is supported by a series of studies conducted beginning in the 1960s. You'll be reading about that in your assigned chapter for next week, and we'll be deconstructing it in class next Monday. Any questions? Yes, you have a question?
Could you please explain how this theory is related to the discussion we had last week?
Well, the ideas we discussed last week are the foundation upon which this theory is based. One is a precursor to the other. Any other questions? Yes, you have another question?
Yes, I'm not sure what you mean by deconstruct.
When we talk about deconstructing an idea, theory, image, or whatever else in this class, I'm using it to mean that we will examine the underlying assumptions and the driving principles. Is that clear?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last part. Could you repeat what you said?
I said that I use deconstruction to mean looking at the underlying assumptions and the principles behind the idea.
Thank you. Will this be on the midterm?
As I've said before, any of the lecture or reading material can be on the midterm. If there are no other questions, I'll see you on Friday.
Now let's ask a couple of comprehension questions. What evidence does the professor give to support his theory? A. Precursor concepts about deconstruction. B. A set of research investigations. 3. A car or plane that fits the theory. Or D. Lectures and reading materials. The correct answer is B. A set of research investigations. At the beginning of the lecture, the professor says this theory is supported by a series of studies. A series of studies is another way of saying a set of studies, a group of studies. And studies, of course, are research investigations. Notice the other answers all use words that were related to the reading. The first answer, A, says precursor concepts about deconstruction. Well, the lecture talks about precursor ideas, and it also talks about deconstruction. Not together, not related, but if you didn't understand completely the lecture, you might think that that was correct. And that's a common thing that happens on the TOEFL exam. They put in words in the wrong answers that appeared in the lecture to try to trick you. This answer number C, a car or a plane that fits the theory. That's related to the word you heard, driving. But of course, driving here doesn't mean cars or planes. It refers to the influential part, the influential principle, the driving principle. And finally, lectures and reading materials. Well, that is incorrect because that's what students are supposed to study for the test, not the basis of his theory. Let's ask one more question. Where is this conversation likely taking place? A, at an academic conference. B, in the professor's office. C, in a classroom or lecture hall. Or D, in an automobile. The correct answer is C, in a classroom or lecture hall. A lecture hall, lecture and the word hall, H-A-L-L, just means a big room where professors give a lecture in the university. A classroom is usually smaller. A classroom may have 30 or 50 students. A lecture hall could have 100 or 200 students. The first answer is incorrect, a conference, because this is clearly a conversation between a professor and a student. At an academic conference, there would be other professors there, usually. It's not in the professor's office because it's also clear the professor says, any questions? Meaning he's talking to a group of people, so it's probably not in his office. And finally, answer D is incorrect, an automobile, because once again, you heard the word driving, so you may think it has something to do with cars, when of course it does not. Remember to listen to our daily podcast, English as a Second Language podcast, as well as our other weekly podcast, English Through Stories. You can get information on both of those on our website at www.TOEFLPod8.com. A new feature on our website, we now have the scripts for all of the stories or dialogues that we used on the TOEFL podcast. So you can get the script for today's lecture by going to our website, and for all of our previous podcasts for the TOEFL podcast. From Los Angeles, I'm Jeff McQuillan. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on the TOEFL podcast. TOEFL Podcast is a production of the Center for Educational Development in Los Angeles, California. Copyright 2005. TOEFL is a registered trademark of the Educational Testing Service, which does not endorse and was not involved in the production of this podcast.